What is the darkest secret you found out about a family member or relative? My dad was born in rural Texas in 1915. He was the youngest of 10 kids, all a year apart, so his oldest sibling, Henry, was about 11 years older than him. My dad's father died in an accident not long after he was born, so Henry became the quote man of the house at about age 11. When my dad was about 9 years old, 1924, a gang of men came through their small town, kidnapping children to work as slaves picking cotton about 400 miles away. This was not an unusual occurrence at the time. My dad and two of his siblings were taken. Henry, who was now 18, came home from working on a cattle drive about a week later and found his mother hysterical about the kidnapping of their 3 children. Being the man of the house at age 18, Henry strapped on his father's 6 guns, dual holsters fully loaded, one on each hip, and set out to get his 3 siblings back. He gathered clues about the gang from other townsfolk who had also had children stolen. He headed east to where he was pretty certain the kids were taken, riding in empty train boxcars and even on the roofs of moving trains. It took him several weeks, but through talking to locals along the way, who heard rumors of child abductions, he finally narrowed it down to a few cotton farms where he thought the kids were. My dad, who was 9 years old at the time this happened to him, had tears in his eyes when he told me this part of the story. He and 2 of his brothers, along with about a dozen other kidnapped kids, had been held captive on this cotton ranch for over 2 months, and had been given up ever seeing home for the rest of their family again. They were kept locked down in a barn and fed scraps and forced to pick cotton in the hot Texas sun. They were beaten if they cried or refused to work. One day, working in the fields, they heard Henry's voice calling their names. They looked up and saw my Uncle Henry walking towards them. They started running towards him when one of their captors rode up on a horse and started yelling. Henry pulled out one of those loaded guns and shot the man dead. My dad wasn't even sure if the man had a gun. Henry didn't care. The gunshot drew a couple more of the rancher and captors over. Henry killed them as well. My dad ran up and hugged my uncle and he told them,
"Let's go home."
My dad told me that they rode on in train boxcars back to the west of their little Texas town, along with a couple of other kids that were stolen from the same town. When they got back to their small farm, my dad said his mom fainted when she saw them. He said Henry put the 6 guns away in the cabinet and never touched them again. There was no law enforcement, no investigation about what happened, that my uncle murdered 3 men to get his siblings back. It was still the Wild West in Texas in the 1920s. The boys eventually all joined the Army and Navy and all served and survived World War II. My dad did not tell me this story until after Henry died. I had always known my Uncle Henry as a sweet, soft-spoken man who went on to own a printing shop. I would never have imagined him capable of the feats of heroics he performed at age 18 to bring his family back together. I found out 2 years ago that my mother had a baby she's given up for adoption 18 months before she had me, and then had another baby when I was 3, and she also gave that baby up for adoption. All 3 of us have different fathers, and I think the only reason she kept me was that my father married her, but the marriage only lasted a year. My mother remarried when I was 5, and my half-brother was born when I was 7. As far as I knew, for 59 years, he and I were our mother's only children. I never saw her pregnant with the second baby because she sent me to live with my great-grandparents across the country during her pregnancy. My mother and grandmother were the only people who knew about this, and they both took the secret to their graves. The only reason any of it was found out was because of all the DNA testing people now do. This discovery impacted my sense of identity for a while, my view of my mother and our relationship. I've met my half-siblings and older sister and younger brother. I like them and I'm glad I've been able to answer some of their questions, but the initial discovery messed with me for a bit. I have to work, so I'll try to give some more info because I can't read everything right now. This happened in the mid to late 1950s. Condoms, well, they weren't available to teenagers at the time. There was no sex education, no abortion, only unwed mother homes. She went to one when she got pregnant with my older sister because she was only 16. I don't know how my mother managed her pregnancy with my brother. She would have been around 21 years old and probably made up a story about a dead husband or divorce or something with the help of her mom. I've never done DNA testing, but the half-siblings have, including the one I grew up with, whom I've always called my brother, not my half-brother. I think they all did Ancestry. The siblings found other relatives first and made their way to me eventually. I don't think I'll ever be able to do DNA testing. I'm done with surprises. The other relatives were the ones who told me about the siblings. The story is even wackier because the relatives were my mother's half-sisters, from the father she never met, and she never knew existed. They found me 8 years ago after extensive genealogy research. I also have a half-brother from my bio dad whom I've met for the first time right before COVID hit. I've known he existed since I was 19, but was not able to find him. He found me. By the way, I'm 62 now. My adopted siblings were better off. Both my parents and my stepfather are dead. I don't believe my stepfather ever knew about the adopted babies. I think the only person who knew was my grandmother. And, well, now you guys. For context, my dad's the second youngest of 15 children. My oldest aunt has a son that's around the same age as my dad. We'll call him Vince. Vince and my dad knew each other growing up and always got along. He was even one of my dad's groomsmen. A few years after that, Vince became very openly religious and would try to get my family members to go to church with him. The thing the family started to notice is that he would change which church he would go to about once a month. Fast forward to when I was 1. There was a family get-together. Vince and his girlfriend showed up and they start making people uncomfortable with their religious talk. Not the normal day-to-day stuff, but telling people they're going to hell for drinking alcohol. Yeah, at a party. Tells people that he's becoming a preacher and they need to attend his services or else damnation, etc. According to my mom, I was sick at this time and she took me to another room to give me some quiet and, hopefully, I would stop fussing. She overheard Vince and the girlfriend in the next room talking about who they can single out and would go along with them. My mom freaked when she heard my dad's name, and Vince said that he would be easy to convince and his job should be able to fund things. My mom immediately went and got my dad and told him what she heard. Well, Dad confronts Vince and huge argument does ensue. Vince ends up leaving and saying everyone's going to hell, they're Satan incarnates, etc. The rest of the family then talked about what happened and then it all came clear that he was not a good guy. His sister had kicked him out because he was mooching off her, refusing to get a job, and she found him stealing from her purse. My aunt had to do the same, for the same reasons. The same story over and over. They realized Vince was just a scam artist trying to live off of others' money. Fast forward to the late 1980s. Not many people have heard from Vince. There's a huge family get-together, and 2 aunts and a few cousins refused to attend because they heard Vince was not welcome. They were saying Vince was the Lion of God, and were wrong to reject him. Another fight ensues, and the 2 aunts and a handful of cousins don't attend. Fast forward to the mid-90s when my grandma passed away. One of the 2 aunts come to the funeral. The other passed away a few years before, with Vince in tow. Vince was warned that he could come to pay his respects but had to behave himself. My aunt was timid and repressed near him and was open and nice when he wasn't around. It was really weird. My parents did not want to talk about it. Later that night, I did some internet searches and found that Vince was the leader of a religious cult. Sucked in my 2 aunts and about 7 of my cousins, and about 30 to 40 various people throughout the years. All the same thing, they must give up their money and belong to join and serve God. Quoted. He especially preyed on immigrants who came over by themselves. He bought some farmland, his disciples work the land, and he sells what they grow, make, and he keeps the money. He's still active to this day, and many people that have left the cult now have websites against him. My maternal grandfather, luckily he's now dead, was a big-time pedophile and molested all the girls on his side of the family, including his daughter, my mother, and from as early as she can remember until her early teenage years. My mom told her mother about the abuse as soon as she could articulate it. Rather than doing anything about it, my grandmother started sending my mother into her dad's room to, quote, wake him up every morning because my grandmother did not like having sex with him anymore and saw this as an opportunity to pass the buck. When my mom became a teenager, she moved in with her great-grandparents to escape the abuse. Eventually, her parents divorced. My grandmother remarried and wanted to fix her relationship with my mom. She told my mom she was abused by her husband as well. She made it seem like she had no control over the situation and apologized for what my mother went through, promising it would never happen again to anyone else. Fast forward about 10 years and my mom gets married and has 2 daughters of her own. She's rebuilt a relationship with my grandmother and feels like the past is behind her. My mom let my sister and I sleep over at Grandma's once. I was probably 7 and my sister was 4, because she believed that her mother had changed. Rather than letting my sister and I sleep together, my grandmother took my sister to sleep in the spare room and made me sleep in the bed with her new husband. Turns out my grandmother did not like having sex with this husband either, and she had a new victim to offer up instead. Luckily, he was not a pedophile. That's the nicest thing I can say about him though. He was a sexist, racist, homophobic piece of shit, and he's also now dead. But I did find it weird that I had to sleep in the same bed as him, and I complained to my mom the next day that his snoring kept me awake. My mother was livid. She called my grandmother, screamed at her for putting me in a dangerous situation, and we did not see her for a long time after that. When we did get back in contact, we were never left to go with grandmother or her husband unattended. Eventually, my grandmother just kept trying to cross my mom's boundaries and we cut contact with her altogether. She reaches out to my mom every few years, but my mom just ignores her. Too much damage has been done. My happy-go-lucky Uncle Dwayne, who had always been a kind word to say about everybody, and was my grandpa's best friend since childhood, did not die of cancer like I was told. My Uncle Dwayne was always so damn kind. The man was infinitely likable. He was one of those people who always greeted you like he had not seen you in years, even if it was only just yesterday. He always welcomed me with this huge beaming smile that would light up his whole face, accompanied by an enthusiastic, almost musical, "Hey there, Roger." I just couldn't help but cheese like an idiot right back, and usually without even realizing I was. The man's warmth was disarming. Even now, after all these years, a little grin always unconsciously starts to creep across my face whenever I think about him. And before I know it, he's gone and done it again and coaxed a smile out of me. So it came as quite a shock when my mother told me, quite matter-of-factly as I recall, that he had committed suicide and it was Christmas Day nonetheless. At the age of 78. He quite literally blew his head off with his shotgun sitting in a lawn chair in the backyard of his home. My grandfather was the first person my aunt called, even before the police. He was the first to arrive and had the unbelievable task of retrieving the shotgun before the cops got there. Apparently, it held some sort of sentimental value, and he had to witness the remains of his lifelong buddy to do it. I can only imagine how painful it must have been for my grandpa to walk up and knock on my aunt's door that Christmas morning, and an unconscious part of him, no doubt, expecting to be happily welcomed by his smiley old friend, just like it's always been, but instead only to be addressed by this uncanny person thing that resembled my Aunt Donna in physical appearance only. Once a classy, vibrant, charming woman, now a fear-eyed, incoherent, babbling mess of human being, cycling between moments of a distant mannequin-like state of catonic shock and ferocious episodes of breathless, abject hysteria. Upon witnessing the grotesque pieces of flesh and body fluids that constituted the waking nightmare taking place on her back porch, Aunt Donna's personality had been violently and irreparably shattered. She never recovered. My grandpa, though, never batted an eye. He consoled my aunt best he could and did the job he came to do and returned to eat Christmas dinner with us just a few hours later. Nobody had a clue of the hellish chaos he's braved. Straight from the belly of the well back into normalcy. I still find his ability to cope baffling. Ultimately, he would tell my uncle and his wife's fate the next day to the older members of my family. I'm not sure I'd ever have the strength to weather anything like that, which was the reason my aunt had called him first before anybody else. We call him our family's rock. Would have been a massive understatement. Not simply a rock, God himself had personally chiseled the man from a solid fucking granite. He was without a silver of a doubt and the toughest son of a bitch I ever knew. He was resilient given human form. As for my speculation of my uncle's reasoning for taking his own life, I always just assumed it had to do with some kind of cognitive decline. Maybe dementia had set in, damaged parts of his brain and caused suicidal depression. Maybe he was beginning to notice worsening symptoms and made a deliberate, calculated choice. Nobody in my family could or maybe would tell me what he was going on. I could not get anybody to offer any goddamn amount of speculation at all. At the end of the day, I'll probably never know. It's been hard to accept. To this day, not knowing why still bothers me a little. I never even got to say goodbye, and I think at least knowing his motivations could have brought me some kind of consolation in the form of understanding or logical reasoning. That's death, I suppose. It's between him and God now. It just goes to show, time after time, you never know what somebody's struggling with just beneath the surface. Be kind to each other. As it turns out, my entire immediate family was in a plot hatched by my mother to have me institutionalized. Basically, to be put away in a mental institution forever. They made the mistake of documenting their shared plan, which were extremely detailed, and which I eventually was aware of and got a hold of due to an email thread containing their in-depth, sinister plan to institutionalize me, and one of them eventually accidentally copied over to me. For context, I should share I do have epilepsy, though it is controlled. And for people that can't have controlled epilepsy, there is never a reason to attempt to institutionalize a person or infringe upon any person's rights that anyone in society routinely exercises. And I have a son, so this was my mother's way of attempting to remove my son from my care. Needless to say, it did not work. I thought about doing TROs, temporary restraining orders, on them, but how does that work for your whole family? In the end, I just had a long, stern conversation with them. Later, after the incident, I think it was a few months down the road after I had a conversation with them about their behavior, a police officer knocks on the door, claims that he's had a report of improper care of my son, etc. I invite him in, and it was pretty obvious to him that there was nothing wrong. He could not say who reported partly, but I suggested it may be my mother, who lives pretty far away, 6 hours plus, who goes through a various amount of issues of forgetfulness, extreme bouts of attempts to control others, often manifesting in strange, harmful ways. The officer eventually confirmed it was her, and I did not get any more problems. This was years ago. No problem since that time. I don't think their plans would have gotten very far, but who knows? It seems like people have been put away for not amazing reasons. My college professor and uncle had always felt off to me, and I never liked to be alone with them. He was loved by both his students and his peers and a lot of his resume professors. Reviews said he was attractive even though he was a balding man in his 40s. I'll never forget the day he made his move on me. It was his birthday, and since I happened to be attending the same college he taught at, I was chosen to deliver his gift. I knocked on his office door. He told me it was unlocked, so I entered. What immediately struck me was that for some reason it was incredibly cold and I could not stop shivering. My uncle was absorbed in something on his computer monitor and did not seem to notice. He enthusiastically waved me over to his desk. "Come here and take a look at this." When I saw the list on his computer, the only reaction I could muster was my mouth dropping in shock. Dark family secrets. Worst advice you've ever been given? Job interview questions. The list went on and on. My uncle looked at me and smirked before saying in a hushed voice, "Nobody knows this, but I post the same questions on Ask Reddit every single week and I get away with it. There's no moderation for these incredibly common questions, so it's easy karma fishing. Then I just sell the account to an astroturfer and move on to the next one." I don't remember much after that besides just knowing that I had to get away. I sprinted as fast as I could out of the room and did not look back. Thankfully, I dared to open about my experience, and although I could not prove what I've seen, nobody trusted him again. Eventually, the rumors made their way around the college and his peers lost a lot of respect for him, as his classes are no longer full with a waiting list. Hopefully, he'll be caught red-handed one day and justice will truly be done. My uncle tells this story that he was a kid. His older brother wanted him to go out hunting with him in the woods near their house. They woke up early and started walking much deeper into the woods than they usually did, and way off the normal trails they used. My uncle realized his brother was letting him get further and further ahead. He stopped and turned around to see his brother starting to bring the shotgun up to his direction. He asked him what the hell he was doing, and his brother said, "Oh, I thought I saw something." My uncle decided to go back at that point. Later that week, he went back and found a pit that someone had dug a bit further off the trail. He never went anywhere with his brother alone again. Both of them are mom's brothers, and the wannabe Kane was a narcissistic of the not letting a silly thing like being married get in the way of his dating life, who decided he had big dreams and bailed on the family and his wife when I was a kid, and proceeded to overdose. Thus, I usually don't think of him as my uncle, because I didn't have any real relationship with him. Not sure why he did not shoot my uncle, might have wanted to look more like an accident, or didn't want to look at his brother in the eye. For those saying it's just a story, yeah, I can't prove it since they were the only two people there, and one of them is dead now. But the way that my uncle described it, he was really afraid of his brother and thought he was capable of
Murder.
My father was killed when I was young. My mother could not handle me, so I went to live abroad with my father's sister, FS. Fast forward 11 years later, my mom died from cancer. In the 11 years we'd visit and talk, I'd say we were even pretty close at some points. In the final stages of her cancer, my mom was barely functional, talking about pine cones and Finland. Mom's sister, MS, started talking to me about inheritance and shit like that. I knew my mom would not pull through, but I sure as hell did not want to worry about what I'm going to inherit before she's dead. It just seems wrong. Father's sister warns me to watch out for mother's sister. When I was young, she did something that caused a huge rift between my parents, and since then, father's sister did not trust her. Father's sister would not tell me what it was for or because she did not want to have a different view of my parents. When mom passed, MS did not want to, quote, talk about money or anything related to it, and told me to wait with the filing for my inheritance. Turns out she had already gone and filed for an inheritance for my grandfather, who's next of kin to my mother, making him eligible like myself. Grandfather was dying of dementia at the time, and MS would be his next of kin, which means grandfather's portion of inheritance would go to her once he died. He did just a few weeks after I found out she filed. Every time she's contacted me, she asked for information that would further her progression in getting a portion of my parents' inheritance. My lawyer is handling this as I'm in a different country, and I can't be present. The whole situation is messed up because I have a very fond memory of MS as a child, and this just made it clear that money will ruin anyone. I finally asked father's sister about this secret because I need to know who I'm dealing with here and how to proceed. Turns out mother's sister and my father got drunk one day and slept together while mom and I were home. They had an affair for a while too. I can't fully blame mother's sister because, well, it takes two people to tango. But I definitely see her differently now, especially in the light of all the events that transpired. Midnight Monster here. That was 9 stories of the darkest secrets that have been found out about family members. If you enjoyed the stories, do subscribe. I hope to see you in the next one.